Hello. So I am going to be talking today about wildfire smoke inhalation and sort of what happens in the body after somebody has breathed in a lot of smoke and some herbal things we can do to support the system and what we can do about that. And right now, as of the time of this recording, there have been some major wildfires in Southern California, and lots of people displaced, lots of homes destroyed. And so we are in a situation right now where there are tens of thousands, maybe even well over 100,000 displaced people as a result of this. Many of them will have breathed in wildfire smoke. Uh, and then there are also people who are in the area who are breathing in a smaller dosage of wildfire smoke in just in the course of breathing the air in areas where the air quality has been affected by that. And to some extent or other, this happens very often. This particular round of it has been extraordinary, but the occurrence of this is not at all unusual, and um, it's something that we're very likely to see more and more of as climate change continues to worsen wildfire seasons and as development in fire-prone areas may continue to go on and put more people in harm's way by planning and building communities in areas that are likely to be affected by this sort of thing. So I am going to talk about what I have found to be helpful in these types of situations, and keeping in mind that a lot of the time when we are dealing with people in this situation, that it might be distance consults rather than in-person consults, and that it might be people who are in a situation where they don't have access to the widest range of herbal medicines. You know, if somebody comes in here into my clinic, I've got a lot of things that I would be able to use for them that they might not be able to find somewhere else. And because of the nature of this condition, it's not really the sort of thing where I'll send you something in a week and then you can start taking it. You know, it's something that's better if someone can get remedies for it right away. So I'm going to focus on remedies that are generally fairly accessible and widely available, rather than some of the more exotic things or more specialized things that you might find in my clinic or in other well-stocked apothecaries. So that's kind of the general overview of what I'm going to be talking about. And so I'm going to start out talking about the physiology of this type of injury, because this is something that, you know, it is an injury rather than an illness. It kind of presents like an illness, but essentially it is an injury to the respiratory system. Um, so when someone is breathing in air that has a lot of wildfire smoke in it, this can be because they're very much in close proximity to a fire and they're breathing in an enormous amount of particulates, or it can be because they are in an area where the air quality is affected by fire and they're breathing in, you know, a lesser amount of it. As the air is breathed in, it passes through the sinuses or through the mouth and throat, and these are the upper airways. As it passes through the upper airways, the passageways are shaped in such a way that they create a lot of turbulence in the air that's being breathed in. And in the course of that turbulence, all or most of the air comes in contact with the sides of the airways, with the respiratory mucosa, which is the continuous lining of wet cells and tissue that line the airways. And these cells and tissues are designed in such a way that when air comes in contact with them, particles stick to the walls. And that keeps you from breathing these particles into your lungs, which are much more sensitive. So it's a protective mechanism. Typically, well, there are several types of cells that make up the lining of the respiratory mucosa. Some of them are ciliated epithelial cells that have little hairs on them that kind of sweep the particles out. Some of them are goblet cells that produce mucus. Some of them are mast cells that release inflammatory substances, which then go on to recruit cells from the immune system into those tissues to help fight off potential infection. Because your body, at least initially, cannot really tell the difference between breathing in dust or breathing in bacteria. So either one can trigger an immune response. And some people are much more reactive than others as far as this goes. Some people, two different people could breathe in the same amount of smoke and have completely different reactions, vastly different reactions, to the extent that somebody might be fine and somebody else might be in a life-threatening situation, even with the exact same exposure. But generally speaking, for any given individual, the more they breathe in, the more reactive their system is going to become, and the more they're going to produce mucus and produce inflammation in the upper airways. So that's two of the things that you would see, even in kind of less severe instances, would be more production of mucus and more inflammation in the linings of the airways. And the linings of the airways, they start in the nostrils and they go all the way into the lungs. It's kind of a continuous lining. And so you see the mucus and inflammation. Often the presence of this mucus will trigger coughing and sneezing. Coughing and sneezing can become their own issue if they are persistent. If irritating stuff gets further down into the airways, you can get congestion in the chest, and you can even get pneumonia, which is essentially fluid building up in the lungs, fluid taking up spaces that air is meant to take up when you breathe in. And that would be in a more serious case of it. So generally speaking, the further down the symptoms are, the more serious they are, or the more potential there is for them to be serious as things get closer into the lungs. So the particles themselves, just by being present, these particles, which are tiny bits of smoke, tiny bits of ash that have blown on the wind, just by being present, just by their physical properties of being small particles, can cause a lot of irritation. A lot of the time, these particles are also toxic. And you can get toxic particles of ash and smoke from perfectly normal things like wood. Wood ash contains lye, it contains sodium hydroxide, which is a very caustic substance. And if you're breathing that in, it's going to be damaging the membranes of the cells that it comes in contact with. It's going to be destroying the membranes of the cells that it comes in contact with. And that can cause much more irritation than if it were just household dust. So smoke can be a lot more irritating than household dust. There can also be other weird substances in it from burning plastic and things like that. So people can have all kinds of different reactions to that might be systemic. But a lot of the time, most of the symptoms are going to be clustered in the respiratory system, at least the initial symptoms. And as exposure increases, a person is more likely to develop more severe symptoms. Sometimes, if somebody has breathed in a lot of ash, or if they've breathed in hot air or hot smoke from being in very close proximity to a fire, like if they were in a building that was on fire or if they were fighting fires, then it is very possible for people to actually get burns on the inside of their respiratory tract and small blisters on the inside of their respiratory tract. Now around here, I'm not sure if this is something that happens a lot with California wildfires, but in the wildfires that happen in this part of the country, we also have a lot of poison ivy, and people breathing in the fumes from that can cause an allergic reaction and irritation and vesiculation, which is tiny blisters on the insides of the mouth and sinuses. All of that is just essentially more inflammation and more stuck fluid, more stagnation of fluid in the respiratory system. So that's how we're going to think about that as we're working to support people's systems and to help them to get better. Is we're going to think about this as being stagnation and inflammation primarily. Stagnation of fluids and inflammation of the tissues around them. And that inflammation is essentially meant to be a protective measure. It's meant to prevent infection that might start in the respiratory system from spreading into the body. So there are lots of white blood cells coming into the respiratory system, and what that looks like is initially you might have clear mucus, often with lots of bits of smoke in it. And then as the respiratory cells are recruited into those tissues and come out through the mucus, it gets more whitish in color. And if they are consuming things that they're coming in contact with and dying and becoming dead corpuscles rather than live white blood cells, then you get a yellowish or greenish cast to the mucus. And none of that necessarily means that you have infection going on, although you can have infection going on. There's going to be a strong immune response that is there to try and prevent this from becoming a point of entry for infection into the body. So symptoms that you might see with all of this, we start out with congestion, sinusitis, pain in the sinuses, sore throat, coughing, sometimes pain in the chest from coughing, or worse yet, pain in the chest when breathing in fully. And then in more extreme cases of it, there might be some fluid in the lungs, which would look like, if you would listen to it on a stethoscope, you'd hear gurgling and crackling in the lungs. And if you're not able to do that, that would often present as shortness of breath and sort of inability to feel like they're getting enough air, which often results in people breathing faster, more rapid and shallow breath. And if somebody gets to that stage, that's dangerous. That is a situation where you might want to have them in an emergency room and maybe getting supplemental oxygen and that sort of thing, if that's an option. And right now, that's an option for people in general, but I like to talk about possibilities because that might not always be an option, and it might not currently be an option for everyone. So, yeah, someone mentions that in the West Coast they typically have poison oak rather than poison ivy, so you could still get some of that same type of allergic irritation from inhaling the urushiol, the oleoresin on it that makes it cause people to itch. So when you're treating people, you want to work on helping the fluids move, and you want to work on decreasing inflammation. And you might also want to work on helping the immune system to prevent potential infection from spreading into the body. So those are kind of the very broad clinical strategies for what you're doing for someone who has inhaled a lot of smoke. And so I'm going to talk about some of the different ways that might present and the different things that we would do to help move the fluids and to help reduce inflammation and to help improve the body's ability to utilize air, essentially, and to heal the tissues that may be damaged, because that can be an important part of it too. So some categories of herbs that we would use for this, or some categories of therapeutic substances that we would use for this, might include fluids and electrolytes, because the more fluids and electrolytes you have, the more able the fluids are to move, the more able your body is to sort of clear out junk that has gotten stuck in your respiratory tract, because it uses fluid to do that. So adequate hydration and adequate electrolytes, because mucus contains salt, takes salt with it, takes electrolytes with it, and so it's anytime that somebody is expelling a lot of mucus, whether they're coughing it up or whether it's draining from their nose or whatever, then they're going to be losing a lot of electrolytes, and that can throw things out of balance. So things like electrolyte drinks, broth, and even just water and food can be really helpful for that. Warm drinks are often very helpful because they seem to help fluids in the sinuses move a little bit more too. Demulcent herbs are super important in this scenario. They help to hold moisture in areas that need moisture, and they help to soothe the throat and the inside of the mouth directly through direct contact. They help to soothe other areas in the body indirectly. Uh, some of the demulcent substances, if you are drinking something like slippery elm or marshmallow, for instance, actually do get absorbed into your bloodstream and do get to other areas in your body and can have that soothing effect on places that they're not directly coming in contact with. So that's another area. That's another category of substances that we would probably be using in a person like this, demulcent herbs. Anti-inflammatories are extremely important. Anti-inflammatories bring down inflammation in the respiratory system, and they're going to decrease the production of this thick, sticky mucus, and they're going to decrease the inflammation in the lungs and in the airways to the lungs, because a lot of the time these airways will become inflamed, and when they do, it's hard for air to pass through them. And that typically presents as wheezing or as noisy breathing. When somebody has inflammation, inflammation is not the only thing that can cause that, but usually when there is inflammation, it will cause some noisiness on the in-breath as the air is trying to make its way through these narrowed passageways. And inflammation in the respiratory system can kill people. When things get really bad with any kind of respiratory thing, whether it's a viral infection or asthma or response to breathing in smoke, it's very often inflammation in those airways that is that's causing the most severe and most immediately dire symptoms. So anti-inflammatories are, if I could only have one category of substance to use in people with this type of situation, it would be the anti-inflammatories. They're more important than anything else as far as getting the person through, because as long as they can keep breathing, everything else will take care of itself eventually. Expectorants are another category of herbs that are used in this situation. And in a lot of the stuff I've seen online, there's kind of an extremely large amount of focus on the expectorants. And the expectorants are nice because they cause people to cough up phlegm, they clear out phlegm, and they are often something that makes a very quick difference, makes a difference in a very noticeable time frame. And so that's a really nice thing. Mullein is one that I've seen a lot of people talking about. Mullein is kind of harsh as far as expectorants go, but it does the job. It provokes coughing, and it makes people cough up phlegm. It's not as good for congestion in the upper respiratory, in the sinuses, but it is helpful there too. Aromatic expectorants like mint, and thyme are also really helpful. Thyme is one herb that I use very often for any sort of injury to the respiratory system, because it has an expectorant effect, and it also has an immune supporting antibacterial effect. And it keeps people from developing secondary bacterial infections, which are a risk anytime there's been any sort of injury to the respiratory system. So that's in the category of aromatic expectorants, along with many members of the mint family, sage, and that's a pretty most of those, especially the mint family ones, tend to be very well tolerated. There's something you can take in large quantities, and that it might be soothing and might make the person kind of feel better immediately. So if somebody has a big cup of a minty tea and it's helping them decongest and it's helping provide fluids, that can be really soothing and really helpful. Another question here is about horehound, which is also a mint family expectorant, but not really aromatic. It's mostly bitter. I love horehound as a remedy for somebody who's coughing a lot, especially not so much when it's up here, but when they're starting to get the postnasal drip and starting to cough a lot. That's when horehound is really helpful. a lot of people hate the taste. I don't actually find it to be all that bitter, but some people feel like it's as bitter as wormwood and gentian and that sort of thing. So some people really don't like to take it, but it's more intense than spearmint, less intense than mullein as far as its provocation of coughing and expectoration. So those are another category of herbs that I would use. Hang on a second. The question here is, yeah, would mullein be considered helpful in its cooling quality? Yeah, it is. It does help some with cooling the whole respiratory system, and it can be pretty good for that. And, I'm not trying to discourage anybody from using it. It's not the first thing I would reach for in this type of situation, but it is something that is, going to have some relevant properties. So expectorants are really helpful. Cough suppressants, I usually don't use. The situation in which I use cough suppressants like cherry bark would be specifically if someone is coughing to the point that the cough itself is causing them a lot of problems. And then I would typically use it along with other things. So it's not necessarily helpful just to cover up the symptom of coughing for its own sake. It might make the person seem less sick, but it might allow the problem to persist. It might allow more fluid to build up in their chest. And then there are more, well, with the anti-inflammatory things, there are different types of anti-inflammatories. And the anti-inflammatories that I usually would reach for first for this type of thing are what I think of as Rasayana anti-inflammatories. In other words, anti-inflammatories that cause bodily fluids to move. Ginger is a great example of this. Ginger is spicy, it causes mucus to drain, and it has an anti-inflammatory effect. And so that can be a really helpful thing for this. Turmeric is similar. It's more easily tolerated by some people. And both of these are pretty common, easy to come by kitchen herbs. I can buy fresh turmeric and fresh ginger at my local grocery store, and I think that you probably can in a lot of places. So they're pretty easy to come by. And so that is almost always going to be a big part of my strategy when somebody first presents with this type of a thing, is to have them take a lot of anti-inflammatory stuff that is going to help fluids move, like ginger. There's another herb called galangal you might not be as familiar with. Maybe you are. It is a very similar plant to ginger, a very similar product to ginger. The rhizome looks like ginger, but it has a camphory type of note to its flavor that is not present in ginger. And it's a little bit more of an expectorant for the chest than ginger is. Ginger is great up here, not as strong down here for moving phlegm. So galangal is a little bit better for that deeper stuff. If you don't have galangal around, ginger and thyme work pretty well together to provide a pretty similar situation. Or ginger and yarrow. Yarrow is a really good herb for the lungs, and it's, people think of it as a vulnerary, right? But this is an injury, and it is helping to heal this injury. But it also contains this camphorol, which helps to thin and break up mucus. And so that can be really helpful in this type of situation. Here are a couple of teas that I got at the grocery store this morning. This is stuff that you can get in a lot of places. This is traditional medicinals. This is not a paid endorsement or anything, but these are pretty widely available and made out of very well tolerated, decent stuff. So there's throat coat tea, which has slippery elm in it. It's a demulcent, soothing. It's also got marshmallow and licorice and fennel, and it's got a little bit of orange and lemon peel as well. And this is something that I've used a lot in my own life, just for my own self and for my own family and stuff like that. And then the Breathe Easy one, so that's more for soothing irritated throat and that sort of thing. The Breathe Easy one is more of a aromatic decongestant. It's got some of the same stuff in it, but it's got this one's got peppermint, ginger, and eucalyptus in it. So it helps to break up congestion and dry up phlegm a little bit. And so that can be helpful. And you can, because these are decent tasting and because they're readily available, a lot of people can just, go and get them. If they're not where you are and you can't make something up special for them, this is something that's off the shelf. That's the two of them together work as a pretty decent formula for this whole scenario when it's not very severe. They don't have enough anti-inflammatory in them to really treat with any kind of moderate to severe inflammation, but in milder cases, it's pretty decent. And if you wanted it to be more intense, you could add more ginger to it, or you could add some turmeric to it and get a more anti-inflammatory and more spicy effect. But that's something that somebody can, go to their local grocery store and get pretty easily in most cases. And, depending on where you go, you might be able to find a wider or less wide variety of herbs. Here in Lexington, we have actually a lot of stuff that you could get off the shelf in multiple different places. We have a pretty good, herbal medicine here is a really long-standing tradition, and people are used to it in a way that they're not in some other parts of the country. But we have our Spanish-speaking grocery stores carry mullein on the shelf, and our mass market grocery stores, we have Kroger and Meijer here, but and Walmart, but I don't know what Walmart has. But we have these places will have a wide variety of herbal teas and things like that. And then we have a health food store that has also a wide variety of things. So not every place is going to have that, but I feel like traditional medicinals would be available in a larger range of places than most things. So, making a big cup of tea that has 2 tea bags of each of those in it is a pretty good for a mild case of congestion and irritation from smoke inhalation. In more sensitive people, and this would include a lot of children especially, sometimes it's helpful to use antihistamine herbs. So nettle, for instance, I use jewelweed as a tea sometimes in this type of situation, and these things tend to reduce inflammation as well as being warm beverages and sources of fluid. But a lot of the time in people who have very sensitive airways, there is a histamine mediated aspect to the inflammation that's going on. So using antihistamine herbs can be helpful in that situation. And that is, very frequently the case in children, and it's very frequently the case in just people who are particularly allergy prone. A second, let's see a couple questions here. Somebody says that galangal is typically available in Asian groceries, both fresh and frozen. It's definitely true at the local one here. Is there much difference between greater or lesser galangal? I am not really sure. I think that there is probably more difference, as far as I can tell, between how fresh it is and the individual plants. I think the greater galangal might have a little more of the aromatic component to it, but I'm not sure that that's consistently true. Let's see. Would OSHA or elecampane be at all helpful, or are they too hot? Elecampane is generally helpful. OSHA can be helpful. I would use OSHA in cases where people have a lot of phlegm in their chest, where they're coughing up a lot of phlegm, And there are other things that I usually use before OSHA, because OSHA doesn't grow where I live. When I get OSHA, it's like gifted to me by a couple of people who do live where it lives and who have a cultural and ecological relationship with that plant. I use lovage and I use celeriac and celery seeds for similar properties. So they break up congestion, they thin mucus, and they have a little bit of maybe an antispasmodic effect on the airways. So they contain similar substances to what's in OSHA. They're not nearly as concentrated as it is in OSHA, but they, will get the job done at a different dosage than OSHA would. Another thing that I've found really helpful in this is I use some herbs that are anti-inflammatory because of the steroids that they contain. And one that I particularly like for the lungs that is not super rare or anything is butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. This is an herb that contains some aromatic expectorant type of things. It contains some of the same bitter principles that are in elecampane. Elecampane would fall into this category as well. The butterfly weed also contains some steroidal anti-inflammatory substances that are really good at reducing inflammation deep in the chest. So if somebody is starting to get that shortness of breath, or if they are having worsening symptoms even though you're trying to treat it, then butterfly weed can be a really good thing. Usually I keep tincture of it around. The way I make the tincture, I'll get into that in a second. I really like this herb for distress in the lungs. So it's something that is not necessarily available off the shelf everywhere, but that I find helpful enough to mention it. And that if you do treat people or are in a community where you're likely to treat people with smoke inhalation, this is a good thing for you to have around. Also, it's good for other respiratory issues that involve inflammation. And so it contains some steroidal saponicides, some substances that are water soluble and that have a steroidal structure and suppress inflammation in tissues. And so when the inflammation itself is a problem is when you want to use this sort of thing. And that would include in a situation where inflammation in somebody's airways is making it hard for them to breathe. So often I will have people take a tablespoon of this tincture 3 times a day if they're having some respiratory distress. And that's kind of the maximum dose that I would use it at, is 15 milliliters 3 times a day. That's a lot, but it makes a big difference, and it is pretty well tolerated. Doesn't tend to cause restlessness or anything like that. It will usually cause people to cough up some phlegm, but it often causes them to be able to breathe notably easier starting a few hours after they take it. It's short acting, so it does have to be taken multiple times throughout the day in order for its effect to keep going. When I make this, I actually make a decoction of, I get the amount that I want for my tincture, and I make a decoction of the roots in 4 times their mass of water, and then I add an amount of alcohol that's equal to the mass of the plant material. So it ends up being 5 parts liquid to 1 part plant material, but starting out using hot water as the extracting medium, and then after it's cooled, adding the alcohol portion of that, and ending up with something that's around 20% alcohol. So, it's not a very high alcohol tincture. The alcohol is essentially there as a preservative, rather than primarily as an extracting substance. It does do some extracting of the aromatic compounds, but the steroidal compounds actually come out in the hot water better than they do in the alcohol. So that is something that I really recommend making and keeping around. So I have a question: is cold infusion better for slippery elm or marshmallow roots? It's a little bit better, but it takes longer to make. So if you need it right now, the warm infusion might be better. If you can have it tomorrow, the cold infusion is a little bit better. It is a little bit slimier. So, it does actually seem to, some of the soluble fiber that is in marshmallow or slippery elm, some of the stuff that makes it slimy, breaks down with heat. So you do get a less mucilaginous product when you use hot water to make the infusion, compared to using cold water to make the infusion. But it doesn't take nearly as long. So, there's a trade-off there. Let's see. So I mentioned time before as something that I would often use in this situation. Time is something that I really feel like helps to keep, if somebody is having a lot of chest congestion and coughing and stuff, time seems to help keep that from progressing deeper into the lungs. And so this is an herb that I use quite a bit for respiratory situations. And yeah, it's something that, that somebody, again, could probably go to just about any grocery store and find thyme leaf and make a thyme leaf tea out of that, and drink lots and lots of that, because it's not super pleasant tasting, but it's not terrible tasting either, and there's no real tolerable upper limit of intake that we know of. You can just keep on taking it, and it will keep on doing what it does. The thymol that's in it gets absorbed into your bloodstream and then comes out. It's excreted through the lungs, through the lining of the lungs. So it's actually getting into your lungs, and that's kind of hard to do with medicine, to get it directly into the lungs without inhaling it, which can be dangerous. So you can take thyme leaf, and it will get in someone's system and come out through their lungs and turn the linings of their lungs into an antibacterial disinfectant type of substance, and also have a direct decongestant action on the airways in the chest. So really, that is one of my favorite herbs for all sorts of respiratory conditions, and one that it was one of the first herbs that I learned, and it's consistently proven itself over all of these decades to be an invaluable thing to use for people's respiratory systems. Let's see what we got here. Honey and elderberry. So honey is soothing, directly topically soothing, and that can be really helpful. Elderberry probably has some effect as far as reducing inflammation. Being an antioxidant, probably is going to have some inflammation reducing effects on the respiratory system. It's not one of the first things that I think of with this, because because there are so many other things that I'm using, I guess. But if that is available, and that's something that is readily available to a person, and well tolerated by them, then I think that that's a totally reasonable thing to do, as far as part of your strategy of reducing inflammation and soothing injured, irritated tissues. So that's definitely something that I think is a possible thing to use. Let's see. I strongly do not recommend any sort of smokable substance while this is going on. If somebody typically smokes anything, it's really not a good idea to do this while the body is injured from smoke. And there are also, some traditional remedies that are smoked. Like here in Kentucky, people smoke mullein sometimes. That's very provocative of coughing, and I would not do it in this. I wouldn't do it in any situation really, but most especially not in this situation. Um, Similarly, any kind of sedative is likely to make this type of situation worse. Any type of sedative substance, anything that's having a sedative effect on somebody is likely to make it a little harder for them to breathe if they're already having trouble with that. Now, if it's just because they're coughing and they're not really having any trouble breathing and they want to take something to help them sleep, then that's probably okay. But if anybody's having any kind of shortness of breath, you really want to avoid sedative substances in that situation. By contrast, stimulant herbs can sometimes be helpful for clearing the airways and opening up, dilating the airways. Because part of what goes on in this type of situation is you get constriction of the airways and spasm of the airways because they get injured. And just like if you hit your thumb with a hammer, you might grab a hold of it and squeeze it, right? Your body does the same thing to pain in general and to inflammation and irritation in the airways, is that it will squeeze around them, it will tighten up around them. And that can suffocate you. So kind of a strange design. It might keep people from breathing in more smoke for a few minutes so that they can evacuate a burning building or something. But apart from that, I don't find it to be the most useful reflex that the human body has. But there it is. And so this spasm, bronchial spasm, is often a part of the clinical picture with people who have breathed in smoke, that they might have wheezing that doesn't get better from anti-inflammatories because it's not from inflammation, it's from spasm and constriction. And caffeine helps some with this. Theophylline helps some with it. Lobelia, if it's available, helps with this. Lobelia is a local herb. I'm not sure how much it's used out there in the world, but in small doses, it opens up the airways and has a relaxing effect on the muscles without causing drowsiness. In larger effects, it induces vomiting, which is not something that you typically want to do in this situation. I consider lobelia to be contraindicated in pregnancy, but in other situations, it's pretty safe. The worst it'll do is make somebody throw up. But usually the dosage for lobelia is something like 1 milliliter as needed. Which type of lobelia? So lobelia inflata is probably the most common one in commerce. The one I usually use here in the clinic is Lobelia syphilitica. Lobelia inflata is stronger, but I actually usually prefer weaker herbs in larger doses rather than stronger herbs in smaller doses. So I mostly use Lobelia syphilitica. They all have lobeline in them, which is the same stuff, and Lobelia inflata has the most concentrated amount of that. So you might only have to use half a milliliter of Lobelia inflata. I'm usually using Lobelia syphilitica, but they're not so different from each other. They're pretty similar. The really big ones, Lobelia cardinalis and Lobelia spicata or Lobelia pallida, are not very strong at all, but Lobelia inflata and Lobelia syphilitica are fairly close to each other. And like I said, inflata is probably the main one in commerce if you're not going out and gathering it yourself. If you are going out and gathering it yourself, then whatever is more common where you are is probably the best one to use. I just make an extraction of it by maceration. I just make a 5-to-1 extract of it by maceration, and seems to work pretty well. Another thing that can help some with spasm, bronchial spasm, is linden, tilia flower, which again, this is something that at least around here I can get tilia flowers in the Spanish-speaking grocery stores. And well, it grows abundantly here too, so I already have it, but if I needed to go out and buy some right now, I could go and do that. But it is, it's kind of calming to the nerves. It doesn't tend to produce drowsiness most of the time, but it does relax these airways. And you can actually combine it with green tea, and it tastes pretty similar to the green tea, and take that internally together. And that's a pretty good thing for wheezing that isn't responding to aromatic cooling herbs or to anti-inflammatory herbs. And whoa, what did I just do? Oh, sorry. So yeah, basically, the deeper in the chest the symptoms are, the more priority you should give them. And for the most part, decreasing inflammation and decreasing stagnation are the crux of what your actual strategy should be. And how you go about that strategy is going to often, in this type of case, be very, very strongly influenced by what you have available to you, what the person has available to them, especially if you're consulting with them at a distance, and also what support they have available to them. Because with respiratory issues, the amount of support that someone has available to them can be a huge factor in whether they can treat it at home, and how much medicine they really need to take and that sort of thing. Because you know, it's much more costly to a person's system to get up and make themselves a cup of tea when they have trouble breathing than it would be under other circumstances. So, you know, it's important to take that into account when you're thinking about your treatment plan with someone who might be in this type of situation. Does licorice root have a place here? Yeah, licorice root is, licorice root and elecampane are both going to have some anti-inflammatory effects for the respiratory system. They're cooling, and they help move fluids. And so they can be, if they're available and well tolerated by the person, they can be really helpful. They tend to help to just have a decongestant effect, mostly in the upper airways, more so than in the chest. Yeah, those can be pretty helpful things. Anything that's really helping the fluids in the body move is really going to be somewhat useful in this situation. So, you know, and they would fall in that category. Burdock could fall under that category as well. Yeah, and the butterfly weed is kind of my choice as far as that sort of thing goes, my first choice, but if it's not available, licorice root could take up some of the same, cover some of the same bases and that sort of thing. And here's a question, what do you think about its warning for people with high blood pressure? So that becomes a factor after a while of use. So licorice makes you, it makes the body get rid of potassium. It makes, has an effect on the endocrine system such that it causes people to spill some potassium through their kidneys. And that over time can lead to an increase in blood pressure. That's easily managed for by either taking supplemental potassium, or in this case, you would use the licorice for a week or maybe 2 weeks. And there's really not much problem with using it for that amount of time. Especially if you're making sure that the person is getting electrolytes and fluids. So, I really don't worry too much about it for this short term of a type of use. For a longer term type of use, that is just kind of part of what it does. And, sometimes you might actually want to be using it to have this effect on the endocrine system. So for instance, I've used licorice a lot in people who have after effects of COVID, because it sort of pushes their endocrine system in the opposite direction of the way that COVID pushes their endocrine system, and it can help things to return to balance a little more seemingly. So, I don't really, I see that as more of a feature than a problem, but, it's not always the right thing to use. But for an acute situation like this, it's fine. It's not going to cause a problem to use it for a week or two. Yeah, so that's yeah, that's definitely something that can be used, and it's in both of these things that I mentioned. They both contain some licorice. But yeah, cooling the system, reducing inflammation, hydrating the system, helping move fluids, and then soothing pain and irritation as they occur, which could mean, something like horehound for coughs, or maybe even cherry bark for spastic cough if it's keeping somebody awake. And then managing things so that they don't get worse, which the thyme is really helpful for that. Breathing in steam that has lavender in it or that has thyme in it can really also be helpful to just kind of move the fluids, move the mucus in the respiratory system as well. So that's another thing that can be helpful. Externally, heat or percussions on the back are often really helpful. People get, if somebody has a lot of congestion and a lot of either wheezing or coughing, you end up getting spasm and tension in the intercostal muscles between the ribs. And when you have that, that can make it harder for people to breathe. So you can kind of get a self-perpetuating mechanical situation that sometimes physical things like a hot shower or using a heating pad or getting a massage or percussions on the back can really help with. So that's something that most people are going to figure out a hot shower for themselves, right? But if they have a place to get a hot shower, but just being aware that situation might be going on with the intercostal muscles going into spasm is that it is can be an important part of the clinical picture as far as their breathing goes. What are your thoughts on neti pot or saline rinse for the sinus and areas affected? At least as like an initial thing to do, it can be really helpful. If somebody is having a lot of mucus that is running, if it's all stopped up, then the neti pot might not go anywhere. The rinse might not go anywhere, but if they do have some fluid flowing through, that can be helpful. Can be help to clear out particles that might still be in there, and it can help to thin the mucus that's there. It's only going to really get to a small area, but it can be helpful and can provide some relief for people. The thing I would say about that and or about saline sprays is that they can be kind of drying if they're done very frequently, like if they're done more than once a day, that can get kind of drying. So if someone is doing that, then they want to make sure that they're also getting lots of fluids and lots of hydration. Sometimes I usually don't use a lot of really pungent herbs in this situation, like horseradish or cayenne or something like that that's going to be really hot, spicy, spicier than ginger. I usually would avoid that, at least initially. Now, if somebody is a couple weeks on and they still have a lot of congestion in their sinuses and stuff, then it might be useful to do that then. But while it's feeling burned inside, either by the chemicals or by the heat or whatever, or just kind of abraded from breathing in particles, during that initial stages, I usually stay away from those hot, very hot or very pungent herbs like that. But they can be helpful a little later on. And some people really do have lasting effects from things like this. So typically there is an acute phase that you're going to get somebody through, but it's not unusual after that for somebody to say 2 years later, I never used to get a cold before I got the smoke inhalation thing happening, and since then I do all the time. Or I never had spring allergies until after the fire, and now I do all the time. So that sort of thing is really common. This type of thing makes the airways more reactive. And sometimes doing a 6-month course of turmeric in a 15 milliliter a day or so doses can help with that. And sometimes nettle as an antihistamine type of remedy will help with that as well. But yeah, it is very common for people to develop more reactive airways after having an injury like this. Yeah, well, it is great to have you here to ask these questions. So does anybody have any more questions about this before we close up? Of course, you can always message me on Instagram and ask later or something like that if you think of something later. But yeah, if anybody has any thoughts or questions about this. Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. And I will probably, this video should be up on my YouTube if you want to refer back to it later. And of course, if you want to ask a question either in the comments of that video or by messaging me, feel free to do so. And if you end up working with anybody in the situation and you have questions about that, feel free to reach out. I'm here for it. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and I will talk to you again soon.